Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into the Sabaton history for the Battle of Midway. Over the next couple of days, I've got a handful of history series that I'm working on. The second half of Congress of Vienna, the flu pandemic, the 1918 Spanish flu. Um, I'm trying to get everything out as quickly as I can, so bear with me a little bit. And I have a couple of more Sabaton songs coming out, so those will all be in the next couple of days. But this is what we're going to do today, the Battle of Midway, Sabaton history. Let's get into it.
The Battle of Midway was a legendary and surprising victory for the Americans in World War II.
We often did songs about naval warfare, so here's another one.
On May 27, 1942, at the large anchorage of Hashirajima in Hiroshima Bay, the mighty Akagi of the Japanese Carrier Division, the proud flagship of Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi of the 1st Air Fleet, began moving out into the Pacific. Even though the Japanese Navy produced the mightiest battleships the world had ever seen, many of the officers believed that the real modern power on the sea lay with the carrier force, the Kido Butai. It would decide winning and losing control of the sea. And so far, the Japanese carrier fleet had proven its worth. By mid-1942, the Japanese had humiliated the Western nations at Malaya and the Indies, had moved towards Guam, Java, the Philippines, Singapore, the British bases on Ceylon, and even raided the north of Australia.
Yeah, the Western Allies were not prepared, were not in a position to defend from a major Japanese offensive. And so when the Japanese started their expansion process, the West just was not ready for it in any way, shape, or form. And so they start to steamroll these places. And some, they get to really vital places in the Pacific, some of the colonial holdings for Britain, and there just isn't a response that's strong enough to stem the tide initially. It's really kind of an interesting part of World War II, where obviously you have all of this stuff going on in Europe, but then in the Pacific, the Japanese are every bit as set on expansion as the Germans are.
They had successfully surprised the U.S. Navy at Hawaii, sinking and crippling many of the warships anchored there. And they had just scored a tactical victory at the Battle of the Coral Sea, though the Allies had prevented an invasion of Port Moresby. But that was just a hiccup, right? That battle merely confirmed that carrier-based operations would be successful against the inferior Americans. But what would be the next step? To go further into the Indian Ocean, to attempt to invade Australia, or move again against the now awakened giant in the east? Marshal Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, knew that the United States had to be crushed before they could bring their industrial might to bear. He ordered Eastern Operation to continue and an invasion of Hawaii. Before they could attempt that, however, the Japanese had to lure the American Navy away from the strongly defended target and towards another one that was easy enough to attack but important enough to trigger an American response. Midway, a tiny two-island atoll in the middle of the Pacific, seemed perfect for that. By June 4th, Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai and its 4 carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Hiryu, and the Soryu, was closing in on Midway. But he was without 2 carriers after the Battle of the Coral Sea. The seas had been foggy for days, and the Japanese plan was already in disarray. Their submarines were nowhere to be seen, and the main fleet was up to 2 days away. But Nagumo didn't worry, since the mighty battleships were only needed in Phase 2. After the bombardment of Midway, once the American fleet had been alerted. And after all, surprise was on their side. Yeah, except that it wasn't. American...
Yeah, and that's the whole name of the game here, right? Midway is just bait. That's all that it is from the Japanese perspective. It holds strategic value for the Americans, but the Japanese are using it strictly as bait here. And so they're going to attack Midway. That's going to force an American response. They're going to lure the rest of the U.S. carriers, the remaining U.S. carriers, out to Midway, where they're essentially going to be just jumped by the Japanese Navy and the Japanese carriers. The issue, which it looks like they're about to get into, is U.S. intelligence had broken, not fully broken by this point, but they had broken enough of the Japanese naval code that they caught on to it beforehand. And they played a pretty cool trick to be able to confirm that it was going to be Midway. I hope he talks about it.
Cryptographers had revealed Yamamoto's rough intentions a few days ago. The code-breaking station at Hawaii had intercepted the traffic between the Akagi and the other carriers. Realizing that something big was up, though they weren't sure of the destination, codenamed AF. So they came up with a ruse. An uncoded message about Midway's desalination system breaking down was sent and was picked up by the Japanese, who interpreted the message that they should bring a water tanker with them to AF. So, Midway it was.
Yeah, think about that's brilliant, right? They think that it's AF because they picked up a radio signal that was sent, I believe, by a Japanese pilot in the Pacific, that he was flying over AF, long before this happened. And so they had down that they thought AF was Midway, but Naval Command was not going on a hunch. So they needed something very specific that would let them know for sure it was Midway. They send out the unencrypted message where it says that the desalination plant is broken, and then the Japanese respond with, giving away that the target is Midway, which is brilliant by naval intelligence. And now the trap is about to be set on the U.S. side, right? That's why I said for the song, it's a trap of a trap. Because the Japanese think that they're reeling in the U.S., but now that the U.S. knows that Midway's the target, they're actually reeling in the Japanese.
Position of our foes. This battlefield's been chosen. Technically in advance. Time to alert our fighters. We're soon in range.
Let's be clear here. At this point, the Americans were indeed losing the war. The U.S. Asiatic Squadron was a shadow of its former self, and the Japanese had both the numbers and the initiative to dictate the course of the war. It would take time for the superior American industry to kick into high gear and change the balance. But what if it was too late by then? Commander-in-Chief of the American Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, took over command after Pearl Harbor and was trying to reassert confidence in the American Navy. And just now, when the Japanese had lost strategic surprise without even realizing it, Nimitz was quick to transfer his 3 available carriers, the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, to the command of Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. The carrier task forces would wait in ambush 300 miles north of the anticipated axis of advance of the Japanese till the attack on Midway began.
And think about how ballsy this is. The U.S. really don't have any carriers left, right? Other than what they're using here. In fact, they don't have a ton of a Pacific fleet in general. So if you're going to set this trap, you're basically taking the gamble of the Pacific fleet, right? At least, for the time being. If you lose here, it's a major, major blow. And, but if you win here, which Nimitz takes the chance, then you can sort of rebalance the Pacific even after Pearl Harbor, even after Coral Sea.
Midway! We meet at Midway! Naval War!
Which it did at 6 o'clock in the morning in large numbers. Each carrier had an array of aircraft to carry out a well-balanced strike. The Mitsubishi Fighter Type 0, the dive bomber Aichi Type 99 with armor-piercing and high-explosive bombs, and the Nakajima Type 97 armed with torpedoes. They were to overwhelm the enemy in one coordinated mass display of firepower. Now, I'm gonna side note here. The key to carrier warfare is to bring in the right planes at the right moment. If there are enemy bombers on the horizon, start the fighters in response. If destroyers come along, answer with torpedo bombers. And if they sight carriers, get the dive bombers on deck. This is why accurate intelligence is so important. Being caught wrong-footed is a death sentence. And heck, even for well-trained Japanese crews, it took hours to rearm and prepare different flight decks.
And like I said, this is all a relatively new style of warfare. So some of these naval battles are just absolute shit shows. I mean, even Midway here, where the Japanese are really scrambling once they realize that not everything is what it seems. I mean, things can break down and get chaotic very, very quickly.
7 a.m., the first wave of bombers was returning from Midway. At 8 a.m., Admiral Nagumo had given the order to prepare for a second bombing run when a message reached him from his reconnaissance planes. Enemy surface ships detected. Spruance's force was moving south. Nagumo's report spoke of 10 enemy units, but it wasn't clear what kind of ships they were. Concluding that 10 ships were not much of a threat to the mighty Kido Butai, he chose to continue the attack on Midway. Well, soon the first American bombers were above them. Tracer bullets lit up the skies as the bombers aimed for Akagi and Soryu. Sharp, evasive maneuvers saved the carriers until the Zeros made short work of the inexperienced American pilots. However, the Japanese anti-aircraft guns had not hit a single target. Something was clearly off, as they were far too slow to react to multi-vector and multi-altitude attacks. At 9 a.m., the reports reaching Nagumo still spoke of cruisers and destroyers. But clearly there were American planes in the air. They had to come from somewhere. The Soryu was repeatedly fighting off enemy torpedo planes, but Nagumo had no idea where they came from, for his reconnaissance was insufficient. None of the Japanese carriers were equipped with radar, and the radio technology in the scouting planes was fairly primitive. And because of the lack of concrete information, Nagumo still chose to continue his strike against Midway. By 10:20, his 4 flight decks were bustling with energy as planes were armed and fueled. Okay, in history, some battles are decided in a day, and some battles are decided in hours. The fate of this battle was decided in 10 crucial minutes. At 10:22, as the entire Japanese carrier force was refueling and rearming their machines, the American dive bombers attacked. And this time, it was the veteran dive bombers from the Yorktown. They engaged the Kaga first, pushing their planes into a dive through a hail of ineffective 5-inch batteries, releasing their 500 and 1,000-pound bombs. The first 3 landed in the water, but the 4th hit the flight deck aft, detonating in the crew compartments. The 7th bomb hit the forward elevator, detonating in the fighter stowage rooms. The bombs blew the interior of the Kaga apart. Another blew up the bridge, killing all the officers. Now the dauntless dive bombers were descending on the Soryu. Multiple bombs simply tore the ship apart. Nagumo watched in horror as both carriers were engulfed in flames and smoke. Everything was blown to pieces. Their engines were dead. Their boilers were ruptured. Aircraft parts, body parts littered the flight deck. Suddenly, the alarm sounded on the Akagi as well, and its AA guns opened up. Then came a massive explosion of a 1,000-pound bomb, detonating after bursting through the middle elevator. It tore everything inside the hangar apart. In just a few minutes, The American bombers had come and gone and had left 3 of the mightiest Japanese aircraft carriers burning. And even though not sinking, burning is bad. For those carriers were full of high-octane gasoline, oil and lubricants, ammunition and bombs, paper and wood. In minutes, they were a raging inferno. Surviving Japanese firefighters were frantically trying to save the ships. Hundreds had died in moments. Many more were now exposed to fire, heat, and smoke. Many of the mechanics on the lower decks and boiler rooms, they were trapped. Further explosions ripped through the ships as ammunition and vaporized gasoline caught fire. Men were literally boiling inside the compartments with no chance to get out.
This is the crucial moment in the heat of the war.
And that's still a reality. You know, the US has been working on their lasers and rail guns and things of that nature. And a whole aspect of why they want them is so they don't have to carry live ammunition on ships, right? Because it's if you get hit and you have live ammunition, it can catch. And if it does, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you could do. It is going to rip that ship apart, which, the Japanese carriers really, really took a major hit at Midway.
To fly and hit our targets down in the waves.
Only the Hiryu escaped untouched, as it was still protected by Zeros and only attacked by ineffective torpedo bombers. But this was a major disaster. A disaster which would have made most commanders turn and flee, but
Yeah, remember, U.S. torpedoes suck.
Nagumo was not most commanders. The main body of the fleet, although 600 miles away, could still make a difference. The Americans had lost a large amount of torpedo bombers in the attack, and if they could be forced to a decisive surface battle, Japan might just come out on top. Since the Hiryu was still intact, he ordered its 24 planes to retaliate immediately. Soon after 1:30 in the afternoon, Nagumo's best dive bombers dove towards the Yorktown. American flak gunners took a heavy toll on the attackers, but at least 2 bombs hit their target. A 500-pound bomb hit amidships and another detonated in the forward elevator. The Yorktown was now burning. But by 2:30, it became clear that not only the Kaga and the Soryu were lost, the Akagi was as well. The Yorktown, though, was still moving, fending off repeated Japanese attacks, sending its planes out to attack the last Japanese carrier.
Yeah, and I can't remember exactly what it was. Somebody let me know. But I'm pretty sure the Yorktown, expecting to get hit, had basically flooded their lines with CO2, had essentially been doing everything they could, and their fire crews really, really did a number on helping to save the ship, right? Somebody will clean that up for me in the comments, or at least please do. But there was a reason why the Yorktown was able to survive, or survive in the way that it did for as long as it did.
At 5 p.m., joined by bombers from the Enterprise, they broke through the cover of Zeros and planted 4 bombs on the bow of the Hiryu, shearing its flight deck off and engulfing it in flames. Kido Butai was no more. So as night fell, the battle was decided. Spruance had no intention of going toe-to-toe with the Japanese surface fleet. The 4 badly wounded Japanese carriers would be scuttled rather than falling into enemy hands. For the Americans, it seemed like the Yorktown could still be saved, but the undetected Japanese submarine I-168 took its chance and torpedoed and sunk the Yorktown. That, and a destroyer, were the American ships lost against 4 fleet aircraft carriers. To this day, the importance of the Battle of Midway is discussed among historians. Was it the decisive turning point of the Pacific War? Was this the end of Japanese expansion? The Japanese had suffered dearly by losing 4 carriers, and the loss of hundreds of skilled mechanics and experienced sailors was a further crippling wound. Well, we know that the war had over 3 more years to go in the Pacific, but it had just entered another round, a round where the sides were suddenly a lot more even.
Yeah, and the loss of the pilots, the mechanics, the sailors, that was the big loss. And honestly, the loss of the like air of invincibility. The Japanese had just been running through everything up to this point. They lose their carriers, they lose a ton of experience in, like I said, pilots, mechanics, sailors. They take a huge blow in the idea that they couldn't or wouldn't lose at Midway.
Going back to what we said at the very beginning, that you often do songs about naval warfare. This is true. Now, why is that?
Personally, I do enjoy warships. I mean, if we are touring and I find out that there's a port in town and they have some naval ships or something like that that you can visit for a museum, for example,
Yeah.
I love to go and see that. I think one of the most impressive, which probably helped us inspire to write a song about Bismarck later, was when we visited the USS New Jersey.
All right, okay.
And it's a very impressive ship. And we actually thought about using it for some of the scenes in the Bismarck music video.
Okay. Huh.
But later we decided to basically render them and do them.
But
in
the
the
Bismarck, I
computer.
mean, it was pretty exciting, the stuff you used anyway.
Yeah.
Now, having been on the battleship New Jersey, has it ever been in your mind to write a song about that specific ship? Or is it more about naval warfare that you're...
No, we were very inspired because actually the USS New Jersey has a lot of interesting stories to it.
Yeah.
I mean, in San Diego there's the USS Midway, which is named
Yeah.
after the Battle
of Midway, although it did not see action at Midway. Of
No,
course.
it did not. It was just launched right after.
It would have been kind of funny if they happened to name it Midway and then, 3 weeks later, guess what happened?
Guess
You're
what
not going to
happened?
believe it. What are the odds? Is this like, even when you were a kid, were you interested in like naval warfare?
Yeah, I was definitely, and I've always had a fascination on boats, basically.
And it's pretty cool that you have a job that you get to write about something you're fascinated by.
Yeah, I mean, my father used to say that if I would be in the Swedish military, I'd probably be serving on a submarine. Not also being so tall, it would fit me.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
And I'm not afraid of small, like being inside of locked in,
Oh, yeah.
even if it would go under the water. I would
I'm scared just
pretty
thinking
okay.
about that.
For me, that would seem like a realistic solution.
Now, did you do lumpen? That's this. They used to have Swedish mandatory military service. Did you do that?
No, I didn't do. They pretty much that year they stopped doing mandatory.
Okay.
Pretty much none, and.
Yeah, I've had people walk me through this about the mandatory service and how it's changed over time and how it may be changing with the Russia-Ukraine situation going forward.
It became more of a voluntarily basis thing. So I went down to do the tests and stuff, and then afterwards I said, I really don't want to do it because I want to play heavy metal until I die. So
pretty good reason, you know.
and they said it's not a reason to quit this, and then I said, well, just give me a gun and I kill everybody in sight. And then they said, well, it's better that you play music then.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for today for Sabaton History.
Thank you.
Man, those concerts look so awesome. Every time I see them, they just look so awesome. Okay, so this was Sabaton History's The Battle of Midway. Really great one. Indy does so well with the history and stuff behind it. Kind of ironic that he's like, hey, it's cool that you like, you like ships and boats and stuff, and you get to write about it talking to Pear. When Indy's whole thing is history, and literally all he does is history stuff. So I would say they both have pretty good gigs for what they like to do. But as always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below, and I'll see you all next time.